Hi Jada, how are you? Yeah, I'm okay, thank you. A bit snotty this week, but like fine. What have you been up to? Oh, that's nice. You're very sociable at the moment. Did you have a nice time? What were you doing? Perks of being 18, I suppose. That sounds fun. Have you been enjoying the new Taylor Swift versions? Have you listened to her epic 10-minute song? What are your thoughts? Nice. I thought you might. I made my husband listen to the 10-minute song in the car, and we were trying to find all the things we thought were about Jake Gyllenhaal. It's just sort of so like melodious though, isn't it? That you don't really notice that it's 10 minutes long. Like it's very calming. This is good news. I have a poetess friend on Instagram who loves Taylor Swift and writes lots of like poetry in response to Taylor Swift songs. You would like it, I think. It is, it's good. She uses quite a lot of the lyrics as like poetry prompts. Have you got any questions about anything, Jada? Anything you want to talk about or ask about before we get started on the work for today? um, it sounds better if you don't, but I appreciate that that's hard to do. But basically, like when you're saying if you agree or not, like presumably you would say like I think blah 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 blah. Just say what you think and take off the I think. Do you see what I mean? So like if you were going to say I think this seems unsubstantiated by the text, you could just say the name of the critic argues X, Y, and Z, but this appears unsubstantiated by the text. Like the whole essay is your opinion, isn't it? You're saying what you think about the play. Does that make sense? You with me? Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. So the plan for today is that we're going to have a look at the characters. And so my first question, predictably, do you have a favorite character and why? Oh, cool. How come? Yes, that's true. And is that something you think that is that just because that's like a personal interest of yours, or is that because of the significance of art in the play, or both? Cool. See if you can guess who mine is. Of course it is. She's cool. She has adventures. She writes poetry. She's not afraid to make socially unacceptable choices in a time when that's a difficult thing to do. I like her. I think she's kind of a badass. Cool. So let's have a look at the characters in a bit more detail. So we've got Kumara, so bad at pronouncing this name, Kumaraswamy, who's the president of the Theosophical Society in Jummapur in India. He greets Flora upon her arrival at the train station in 1930. Then we have Flora Crewe. She is an English poetess who travels by herself to India in April 1930, presumably for her health, to live and write. In India, she encounters Nirad Das, an amateur artist who paints her portrait while she writes. Flora learns from Das about the struggle among Indians for independence from British colonization. Flora's interactions with Das take on an erotic tone when, one day, overcome by the heat, she lies naked in her bed while talking to him. While in India, Flora is also courted by the British official David Durrance. Flora dies and is buried in India in June 1930. Over 50 years later, in the mid-1980s, the scholar Eldon Pike, who has published the collected letters of Flora Crewe, is collecting information for a biography he plans to write about her. Pike attempts to determine whether or not Flora had a relationship with Das, and whether or not a nude painting of Flora by Das actually existed. After Das's death, Nirad Das, his son, finds no, that's not right. Anish Das, that should say, that's a mistake there, sorry. I'm going to fix it now. Sorry, after Das's death, Anish Das, his son, finds the nude watercolor miniature in a trunk of his father's belongings. So Anish Das is the son of Nirad Das. In the mid-1980s, Anish visits the home of Mrs. Swan, Flora's sister, in England, to learn more about his father's portrait of Flora. Anish had seen the reproduction on the cover that the collected letters of Flora Crewe and recognized the style as his father's. Anish tells Mrs. Swan that after his father's death, he had found a watercolor nude portrait of a European woman who turns out to be Flora Crewe. Nirad Das is an Indian man who first meets Flora after her lecture to the Theosophical Society in India in 1930. Das is an amateur painter and asks to paint a portrait of Flora as she sits writing her poetry. During these painting sessions, Das and Flora discuss the politics of Indian colonization by the British Empire. Das is at first overly polite and subservient to Flora, but she encourages him to be his Indian self in her presence and speak to her more naturally. During one painting session, Flora, overcome by the heat, ends up lying naked in bed under a sheet, while Das sits uncomfortably in her bedroom. Over 50 years later, it is discovered that Das did indeed paint a watercolor miniature nude portrait of Flora, in addition to the portrait which appears on the cover of the published collected letters of Flora Crewe. In 1930, Das was arrested for throwing a mango during a riot in protest of British rule over India. After his death, Anish Das, Das's son, discovers the nude portrait among his father's belongings. Dilip is an Indian man who attends to Pike at the hotel in India and helps him track down information about Flora. David Durrance is a British official in India who briefly courts Flora. He asks her to marry him, but she refuses, and it is unclear whether she chose to have an affair with him. Then Nazrul is the servant at the home in India where Flora stays. Eldon Pike is a scholar of Flora Crewe. He has edited the collected letters of Flora Crewe and in the mid-1980s is gathering research for a biography of Flora. As part of his research, Pike first visits Eleanor Swan, Flora's younger sister, and then the hotel in India where Flora stayed. Pike, while well-intentioned, is thoroughly absorbed in his scholarly perspective on Flora. He continually cites facts about her life and persistently attempts to ascertain the truth about Flora. Pike is especially interested in tracking down various paintings of Flora by various artists, famous and unknown. He is also especially interested in determining whether or not Flora had a relationship with Das and whether or not she posed for a nude portrait by the amateur Indian painter. And then Eleanor Swan is Flora's younger sister. In the mid-1980s, Pike, who is gathering information for a biography of Flora, visits her at her home in England. She is then visited by Anis Das, the son of Nirad Das, who wishes to learn more about his father's paintings of Flora. Eleanor, called Nell in her younger years, continually offers tea and cake to her guests. She is skeptical about the value of Pike's research on her sister, but is more receptive to Anish. After Flora's death, Eleanor had travelled to India to visit her sister's grave, where she met Eric, whom she subsequently married, but who is deceased during the present time of the action. Have you got any questions there before we do some activities with that? Cool. So the first thing I'd like you to have a go at doing is making a character tree to show the relationships between the characters. A character tree, I think we've done this before because I'm pretty certain we did it for Small Island, but it's just like a family tree, but it shows the relationships between characters instead of the relationships in a family. Perfect. I find a character tree incredibly helpful, especially in a play like this where the chronology is complicated. Of course. No problem. No problem. No worries. No, that's it. Perfect. So I want us to have a think about character studies for the major characters. By major, I would consider those to be Eleanor, Eldon, Nirad, Anish, and Flora. But I think that maybe we'll have a look at the critical essay first and then come back to the character studies, if that's okay. Cool. So this critical essay is about propriety and possession. In a 1995 interview with Mel Gusso, Tom Stoppard called his play Indian Ink a very cozy play, but perhaps worryingly cozy sometimes. His comment refers primarily to the play's setting, in which characters interact over tea or while having portraits made. Stoppard also implies that the seriousness of the play might be lost in coziness. Personal and political conflicts in Indian Ink are brought up obliquely, politely, and without being resolved. However, by interweaving three separate but related scenarios that span a critical juncture in the political relations between India and Britain, Stoppard's cosy play demonstrates how these matters inflect personal relationships. The three scenarios form a theatrical triptych that allows the viewer to see all of the action at once, in collapsed time and space. This element encourages comparison, with the result that the slow, subtle shifts of history appear startling and sudden. Indian Ink reveals a cultural shift from a society obsessed with personal propriety, overtly concerned with how people may act, to a society obsessed with possession, concerned about who may own what. The first scenario takes place in 1930 in India between poet Flora Crewe and Indian artist Nirad Das. The second portrays a visit to her aging sister by Das's son, and the third regards the annotation of Flora's posthumous letters by Eldon Pike. The mystery of whether or not Flora and Das had an affair complicates the relationships in all three scenarios, and also affects the true ownership of certain paintings that came into Flora's possession, including the one on the cover of her collected letters. Three interrelated variations on the theme of propriety appear in the three scenarios. A theme of social propriety pervades the scene between Flora and Das, while a theme of possession pervades the scenes between Mrs. Swan and Anish Das, and these merge into the theme of interpretation as Flora's biographer Eldon Pike stumbles through his investigations of her life. All three themes ultimately deal with what is proper behaviour, and the events that illustrate them all stem from the initial scenario of Flora and Das. A writer juxtaposes parallel events or relationships to draw attention to what has changed and what has remained the same. 65 years separate the events narrated in Indian Ink, an interim that saw the decline of the British Empire, the independence of India in 1945, and the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. These changes followed hundreds of years during which India tolerated encroaching European oppression, a cultural phenomenon at which Emily Eden expressed amazement in 1839. I sometimes wonder they, the Indians, do not cut all our, the Europeans, heads off and say nothing more about it. Stoppard closes his play with Eden's comment, along with a description of her party's polite amusements in front of at least 3,000 Indians who looked on and who bowed to the ground if a European came near them. Including this actual first-hand account, the timeline of Indian-European relations portrayed in the play encompasses over 150 years, from the golden age of British imperialism in India to its gradual exit. Momentous changes took place on the heels of Flora's visit, representing a critical juncture in Anglo-Indian relations, and finally in the relations between British and Indian society. The theatrical triptych in Indian Ink conveys how these changes inevitably affected individuals. Two of the triptych panels comprise a parallel set of personal relationships, each being a scenario between a Mem Sahib, the respectful term used by Indians for a white European woman, and an Indian man. Flora Crewe, a poet travelling in India in 1930 for her health, shares an intimate relationship with Nirad Das, an Indian artist with an affinity for all things British. Flora had led a scandalous life in Europe, but she is not so free in India, where strained political relations between colony and colonizer are kept under control by strict social prohibitions against interactions between whites and natives. As Dillip remarks years later about the possibility of Nirad having painted a nude portrait of her, in 1930, an English woman, an Indian painter, it is out of the question. Intimacy between Indian and European carries the power to disrupt the fragile political equilibrium. Flora and Das must neither respond to each other as man and woman, nor as artist and model, nor even as one human to another. Das's assistance at Flora's attack of breathlessness would certainly be misinterpreted by gossips. Nevertheless, drawn perhaps by the same curiosity about Indians that drove Miss Quested in A Passage to India, Flora risks her reputation by seeing Das alone, and Das flirts with social suicide by telling her of his nationalist sympathies. In this part of the triptych, with its theme of the propriety of personal relations, everyone, from their contemporaries to Flora's biographer, misunderstands Flora and Das's real relationship. And in the restrained social climate, they themselves misunderstand each other's intentions. By never revealing whether or not they had an affair, the scenario asks whether it is proper to prescribe how two people may conduct a relationship. The second scenario takes place in 1985 between Flora's aging sister, Mrs. Swan, and Das's son, Anish Das. Though political tensions remain, the passage of time has loosened the rules of propriety that restricted Flora and Das. In the liberated 1980s, Anish Das not only has publicly painted a nude British woman, but has also married her, and he not only mentions his political sympathies, but he also openly accuses the British of incarcerating his father for his nationalist views. He is free to discuss his views, as he explains to Mrs. Swan. My father was a man who suffered for his beliefs, and I never have had to do that. But despite the new liberalism, Anish cannot broach with Mrs. Swan the subject of the ownership of the portrait his father made of Flora. He verbalizes only excitement about his father's work being published, exclaiming, "But replication, that is popularity. Put us on book jackets, calendars, biscuit tins." Questions about who receives the royalties for the image and whether the painting is properly attributed to his father's name remain unstated, but come quickly to mind to audiences familiar with contemporary debates over copyright ownership. Furthermore, the audience is prepared for this topic by the brief mention of a Modigliani nude of Flora destroyed by a jealous boyfriend, an instance of prudish propriety overriding legitimate ownership. Another question of legitimate ownership arises when Mrs. Swan and Anish Das show each other the paintings they have inherited. Anish has kept the nude portrait of Flora left him by his father, although it seemed valueless to him, and Mrs. Swan has held on to the erotic 18th century painting of the Gita Govinda, her gift from the Rajah. Although neither Anish nor Mrs. Swan properly interprets or values their own inherited pictures, they each have a reason to value the one the other owns. Mrs. Swan recognizes that Eldon Pike would want the nude Flora, though she would want to hide it from him, while Anish might well understand why the Rajah's son bemoans the loss of the Gita Govinda, a national Indian treasure and part of a priceless and incomplete series. Under the prevailing mood of regret for imperialist transgressions, the audience might well consider it wrong not to return the painting to India. Likewise, Mrs. Swan would probably want to own the nude of Flora to keep it out of the public eye. The Swan-Anish panel of the triptych raises, but does not resolve, questions of possession and legitimate ownership, nor does it resolve who should own artifacts. In the third panel of the triptych of Indian ink, Flora's former possessions filter down to new owners. The bulk of her poems and letters go to the literary bounty hunter Eldon Pike, who gobbles them up like the notoriously ravenous fish of his surname. Eating slice after slice of Mrs. Swan's cake, he easily obtains the rights to her sister's letters and her portrait, a treasure that will earn him money and fame in the literary world. Mrs. Swan withholds the erotic Gita Govinda from him, however, out of family modesty. Thus, the third scenario raises issues of epistemological stability, indicating how easily truth is muddied up here by self-interest. In addition, Pike conducts his search with the narrow aim of a spear gun, missing artifacts a wide net might catch, and he fabricates the truth as he guesses what he should look for. His Indian assistant Dilip mocks Pike's quest to find the nude Flora picture, saying, "You are constructing an edifice of speculation on a smudge of paint on paper which no longer exists." The Pike-Dilip triptych panel treats the postmodern mania for information and its inherent problems of gathering and interpreting it, asking the question whether it is possible to understand the past completely. The interplay of dialogue and content across the three scenarios of Indian Ink imposes another complexity to the play, but also offers further insights. Glaring errors in Pike's footnotes and Mrs. Swan's obfuscation of the truth are part of a Stoppardian subtext of epistemological uncertainty. The play's many contradictions, first one perspective, then immediately another, accord with Stoppard's 1972 statement that "I write plays because writing dialogue is the only respectable way of contradicting myself. I put a position, rebut it, refute the rebuttal, and rebut the refutation." In Indian Ink, he poses many competing ideologies about personal and political propriety and about the legitimate possession of things and of ideas, without really privileging any of them. The audience is left to make up its own mind. He remains true to his reputation for raising and not resolving the big questions, such that critic Michael Billington defines the adjective Stoppardian as a wariness of commitment and a distrust of fixed ideologies. Although Indian Ink may seem cozy and polite, it leaves the audience troubled by important and pertinent questions about proper behavior, questions that remain as troubling today as they did 65 years ago when Flora did or did not have an affair with her Indian portraitist. So this essay is by Carol Hamilton, and it's from an essay that appears in Drama for Students, which was published by the Gale Group in 2001. Do you have any questions about it, Jada? It is a bit confusing. I'll summarize it for you because you might find that helpful. So the essay basically starts with the idea that Tom Stoppard refers to his play as being cozy, and it has perhaps an outward appearance of coziness because of the very English sort of tea and cake nature of the sort of two conversations really that the play is based around. Three conversations that the play is based around. And really what the essay is arguing is that although it has that cozy facade, it's actually asking some quite difficult questions. And one of the questions that it's asking about is what constitutes proper behavior. So it's exploring the way that social expectations of behavior, particularly for women and maybe perhaps particularly between races, has changed. Like it's not really socially acceptable for Flora to get naked in front of Nirad, but it's fine for Anish, Nirad's son, to have married a European woman. And it's not really okay for Nirad to suggest that he would like India to be independent. But by the time Anish is talking to Eleanor about that, it's totally fine to say that because India is independent. So it's talking about how what's proper changes as time moves on. And then it's also talking about ownership. So does Flora's family own the things that she was given in India, which include paintings by Nirad and include a very famous Indian artifact painting, the Gita Govinda. Or ought she really to credit, or ought her family really to credit Nirad with the portrait and to return the Gita Govinda to India? And the same really with the nude portrait that Anish now has of Flora. Like, is that something intimate between Flora and Nirad? And if that neither of them are still alive, it should be returned to Flora's family to protect? Or does Nirad and his family, as the artist, retain the rights to that? Could they, exhibit naked Flora from 1930 to the world if they chose to? And really, the role of Eldon Pike is to explore that idea, because he doesn't know Flora or Nirad, and yet, because of his interest in Flora and her poetry, is trying to find out intimate details about their private lives that he intends to write about and publish to the world. And one of the things that the play seems to be suggesting is that it's not necessarily the right people that are attempting to make those discoveries. Like, Eldon Pike doesn't seem like a very competent biographer. He doesn't understand the world and the life that Flora Crewe lived. So he misses lots of things, he misinterprets lots of things, and then publishes that so that everybody believes his misinterpretations. Do you see what I mean? So I think part of the reason why it's difficult to figure out the main point is that there are really three main points. So what I'm going to get you to do with the essay is the same thing that we did with the other one. Was that last week or the week before? So to think about whether or not you agree, now that we've worked out what its points are, and to go back through and just to select critical quotations that you can use in your own essays. So to add to that bank of critical quotations that we're trying to generate. So I'll go back to the beginning and you can just let me know when you're ready to move through the slides if you like. Awesome, well done. So what did you think? What do you think of the essay? Which quotations did you choose? Don't have to tell me all of them, obviously. I'd just like a sense of what you think. No, I don't know that I think he's evil. Yeah, just in that kind of like slightly arrogant way in which men sometimes think they know a woman better than she knows herself. Very good. Sounds excellent. So do you have any questions about the essay before we make a start on the character studies? Awesome. So you can start with whichever character you like. Um, start with Das if he's your favorite. And it's just the usual kind of character study stuff that we always include, a little bit about what we know in terms of what they look like and stuff, how they relate to other characters, their role in the play, any themes you think they're linked to, whether or not they change or develop as the play progresses or are just revealed to us more, what you think their function is, and then key quotations either by or about them. How are you getting on, Jada? Excellent. Well done. Have you got any questions? Awesome. Okie dokie. Have you got sociable and exciting plans for your weekend? That's really fine. Don't worry. Time for a bit of a rest. I guess then what this is the last weekend, isn't it, in November, and then December is always just insane. And it's so counterintuitive to me. Like I really want to hibernate in the winter. Like I don't really like winter. But everyone wants you to do stuff and I just end up getting really exhausted because I'm like, no, I should be curled up by my fire with a book. I can't come to your Christmas party. Anyway, I hope that you have a very nice, restful weekend. Have a good week. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much. Bye.